Hi class, in this recording we're going to pick up and continue our discussion of the sexual cycle within the female anatomy. As we look at the sexual cycle, it on average lasts 28 days. And I want to emphasize here, this is an idealized average. But even though it's an idealized average, only 10% of adult women report having their monthly cycle last this time period. For many women, it's as short as 20 days or as long as 45 days. As we look at this cycle, the hormones from the hypothalamus, particularly gonadotropin-releasing hormone, helps to regulate the anterior pituitary gland. Those pituitary hormones are then in turn going to travel to the ovaries, and notably luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. And while they travel to the ovary, the ovaries are going to release hormones in response that will regulate the uterus. Those hormones include estrogen and progesterone. So in terms of the glands and the organs, we have hormones from the hypothalamus traveling to the anterior pituitary gland, and then from the anterior pituitary they go to the ovary, and from the ovary they go to the uterus. And then those ovaries are also going to exert feedback on the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus as well. So there's a lot of tug and pull and interplay as we look at this sexual cycle. In terms of our typical cycle, day one of the sexual cycle is marked with menstruation. That is the event of day one. And for the ovarian cycle, that's when we start on day one of the ovarian cycle. In terms of our average or idealized ovarian cycle, day 14 is going to be ovulation, when that secondary oocyte is ovulated from the mature follicle. Before ovulation, we have the follicular phase, and that follicular phase of the ovarian cycle is when we have the follicle present. After ovulation, that follicle on the ovary is going to turn into the corpus luteum or the corpus albicans, and that second 14 days is going to be known as the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle. So as we look at that 2-week follicular phase of the ovarian cycle, we have menstruation occurring during the first 3 to 5 days, and during that process of menstruation, the uterus is going to start to rebuild itself. So it's to slough off the functional layer of the endometrium. And after sloughing off that functional layer of the endometrium, it's then going to start the process of regenerating its functional layer from the stratum basale, or the basement layer of the endometrium. As we look at the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle, that mature follicle, sometimes referred to as a tertiary or Graafian follicle, turns into a corpus luteum, and that corpus luteum is going to release hormones that cause the lining of the uterus to get thicker, the endometrium to get thicker. In particular, the new hormone that's being introduced during the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle is progesterone. And if pregnancy does not occur, that corpus luteum is going to involute, form the corpus albicans, and be a little tiny scar on the ovary. If implantation does occur, we find that there is a hormone released from the zygote, the implanted blastocyst, and that hormone is human chorionic gonadotropin, and that human chorionic gonadotropin keeps the corpus luteum from degenerating so that the concentrations of progesterone remain elevated, and that we don't have the endometrium breaking down and sloughing off the implanted blastocyst. But that assumes fertilization and implantation. If there's no fertilization and implantation, menstruation will begin and the cycle starts all over. So as we look at our ovarian cycle, we have the follicular phase for the first 14 days, ovulation at day 14, and then the luteal phase for the last 14 days. And the names of these phases correspond to what's happening on the ovary. The follicular phase is when there's the follicle on the ovary. Luteal phase is when we have a corpus luteum on the ovary. And this is also going to mirror changes within the hypothalamus and pituitary glands as well, and the hormones being released. Notably, there is a huge surge in luteinizing hormone immediately before ovulation, and that surge in luteinizing hormone causes or triggers the ovulation of the secondary oocyte from the mature follicle. So, we're going to camp on the next 3 slides for a while. Let's look at follicular phase in detail. So that's the first 14 days. During the first 14 days, we are going to have relatively low concentrations of estradiol being released from the follicle of the ovary. So here's the organ. The organ is, I really need to shift to blue here. Here we go. So the organ is the ovary, and we have a follicle on the ovary, and that follicle is releasing estradiol in low concentrations. And a low concentration of estradiol is going to go up to the hypothalamus and downregulate gonadotropin-releasing hormone secretion. And as that downregulates GnRH secretion, it's not going to completely stop it, it just reduces it. And we'll have a very small amount of GnRH going to the anterior pituitary gland. And that very small amount of GnRH goes to the anterior pituitary gland and causes the anterior pituitary to release luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. And in particular, follicle stimulating hormone is going to travel to the follicle and make the follicle a little bit bigger, just like luteinizing hormone does. But mostly it's the follicle stimulating hormone that increases follicular mass. And as the follicle gets bigger and bigger, it secretes more and more estrogen. But as long as we remain at a relatively low concentration of estrogen, estrogen will have a negatory or an inhibitory, I should say, an inhibitory effect on the hypothalamus's release of GnRH. It's also worth emphasizing that only one follicle a month typically is going to ovulate. So as follicle stimulating hormone travels to the ovaries, it's going to stimulate multiple follicles to grow and secrete estradiol. However, only one follicle is typically going to become the big one that will ovulate, and that's the dominant follicle. And this dominant follicle will have increasing sensitivity to luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, and as it becomes increasingly sensitive, it's going to grow faster and faster and will become even more sensitive and grow even faster and become even more sensitive. So this dominant follicle will enter into a positive feedback loop very quickly. And as we look at that follicle, eventually it's going to ovulate. And to get to that ovulation stage, we are going to need to expose the pituitary gland to expose the ovary to a surge of luteinizing hormones. We'll have that big rush of luteinizing hormone. And to get that rush of luteinizing hormone to trigger ovulation around day 14, the follicle is going to have to release more and more estrogen. And as the follicle's been exposed to low levels of follicle stimulating hormone, that low level of follicle stimulating hormone causes the follicle to get bigger. And eventually the follicle becomes so big, it now is secreting a high concentration of estrogen. And a high concentration of estrogen has an excitatory effect on the hypothalamus, causing it to release increasing concentrations of gonadotropin-releasing hormone. And as we have an increasing concentration of GnRH, that's going to cause more and more FSH and LH, which causes the follicle to get bigger, which causes more estrogen, which causes more FSH and LH, which causes follicle to get bigger, which causes more estrogen, and the positive feedback loop begins to cycle out of control, and we have rapid fluctuations within the hormonal levels of the female's anatomy and physiology. And this cycle needs to be stopped. And there needs to be a very dramatic event to stop this positive feedback loop. And this very dramatic event is ovulation. After ovulation, we are going to take that mature follicle and get rid of it. And the follicle is going to be converted to a corpus luteum, or the yellow scar. Now let's focus on the uterus. We've been kind of ignoring the uterus right now. That estradiol that's been secreted is going to cause the endometrium of the uterus to get thicker and thicker and thicker. Post-ovulation, though, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let's talk about changes to the uterine tube, also known as the fallopian tube. And as we look at this uterine tube, right before ovulation, it's going to swell with edema. It's going to have an extra large amount of fluid entering into it. And that's going to cause the lumen to become exposed so that we can have the easy passage of the egg into the uterine tube. And then we're going to have lots of small ciliated cells that beat their cilia to move the oocyte through. Those fimbriae, those little tiny fingers that come off of the uterine tube, will envelop, should put an E right there, the ovary, and it's also going to envelop the oocyte. And what we find is that the fimbriae gently pulsate and caress the ovary. And the pulsation and caressing of the fimbriae over the ovary is in rhythm with the woman's heartbeat. So when there's that pulse of atrial blood pressure, that pulse of pressure causes the fimbriae to wiggle a little bit or to wave a little bit over the ovary in anticipation of capturing that ovulated secondary oocyte. In terms of some changes to the exterior opening to the body, the external os, we find that when the woman is fertile, her cervical mucus is going to become thinner and stretchier. It's going to resemble an egg white. And this is important to know. When a woman samples her cervical mucus, that cervical mucus can be very thin and runny, or it can be very thick and coagulated. If it's very thick and coagulated like it is right here, that represents a period in the monthly cycle when the female is not going to be fertile, not capable of fertilization. However, there's a very brief period of time where there's a viable secondary oocyte within the reproductive tract. And that brief period of time corresponds to the mucus becoming very stretchy. It also corresponds to an increase in the base body temperature of 0.4 to 0.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And as we look, and this is more of a rare thing, not all women experience this, but some adult females will experience Michelhertz pains, which is a twinge on either the right or the left side of the lower abdominal pelvic cavity, and that corresponds to a rupturing of a mature follicle during ovulation on either for the left or right ovary. In terms of conception for females, the best time to be having sex in terms of wanting to conceive is going to be approximately 24 hours after the mucus changes and there's that increase in the baseline temperature. Or another way to think of this is the first 24 hours after ovulation, because that secondary oocyte is only going to remain viable for typically 24 hours within the female reproductive tract. So let's go back to the hormones of the cycle, where we've talked about ovulation, we've talked about the follicular phase and how it led to ovulation, and now we're at the post-ovulatory, the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle. And now instead of having a follicle on the ovary, we now have a corpus luteum on the ovary. This corpus luteum is going to release high concentrations of estrogen and progesterone. And these, low concentrations of estrogen and high concentrations of progesterone. And they are going to have inhibitory effects on the anterior pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. They cause the hypothalamus, in particular the progesterone is highly inhibitory, will cause the hypothalamus to downregulate GnRH production and cause the anterior pituitary to reduce the amount of LH and FSH it produces. So that progesterone is going to be a potent inhibitor of the gonadotropins and the gonadotropin releasing hormone, ultimately making it so that a follicle doesn't begin development during the second half of the ovarian cycle. The estrogen and progesterone travel to the endometrium of the uterus, and in particular, the progesterone is going to cause the endometrium to have uterine glands develop so that there can be a source of uterine milk for the implanted blastocyst. The transformation of the corpus luteum, the follicle into the corpus luteum is going to correspond to the theca cells within the follicle, the theca internal cells, multiplying and eventually filling up the antrum that's been left over, and the space that's been left over from the mature follicle. And that corresponds to the ruptured follicle becoming the corpus luteal. And those theca cells have a lot of lipid accumulated within them, and they've been renamed lutein cells within the corpus luteum. And that yellow lipid that accumulates within the theca folliculi, or theca interna cells, is what gives us the yellow color of the corpus luteum. As we look at our ovarian cycle and as the continuation of our discussion, we find that the regulation of the corpus luteum is going to be, or the formation of the corpus luteum will be regulated by luteinizing hormone. And it's going to stimulate the corpus luteum to continue to grow and secrete increasing levels of estradiol and progesterone. We find in particular, though, that it's the progesterone, and we have a dramatic increase in progesterone during luteal phase that is going to focus on preparing the endometrium of the uterus for a possible implantation, a possible pregnancy. And as we go through the next 14 days of the luteal cycle, the remaining 14 days of the ovarian cycle, we find that luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone are both going to reduce in concentration over this period of time. And as we have less and less luteinizing hormone, the corpus luteum is going to start to shrink and involute and become smaller. As that corpus luteum shrinks and becomes smaller, eventually it is going to turn into something called the corpus albicans. Albican referring to white, corpus for scar, the white scar, corpus albicans. And this involution is going to begin on day 22 of the monthly cycle, and by day 26 of the monthly cycle, assuming 28 full days, the corpus albicans has formed. Now, this ovulation that occurs per cycle is typically going to alternate from one ovary to the next ovary, so alternating left, right from month to month. Occasionally, though, we can have two ovulations occur within the same monthly cycle, but that is an exception. As we look at the ovulated oocytes, they typically are going to start ripening or maturating about 290 days before ovulation, and they have their development begin in utero. When that young female is in utero, that's when they initially began development to become the primary oocyte within a primordial follicle of the ovary of the unborn female. That's all we have for this recording of the ovarian cycle. Oofda! There was a lot. We spent about 20 minutes on about 9 slides. If you have any questions or comments on this material, please feel free to let me know. Post them in the class discussion boards or shoot me an email. And as always, class, happy studies.